we want to tell you about another podcast from PRX called Monumental. This podcast explores questions about the past, present, and future of U.S. monuments, uncovering the stories about what and who is important, as well as the stories that have been left out. Join host Ashley Seaford across the country with their team of journalists. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, December 3rd, 1997, President Bill Clinton held the first in a series of town hall events in what was known as his National Conversation on Race initiative. 67 panelists and residents from around Akron to Ohio gathered to have a conversation about racial bias, ignorance, affirmative action policies. Clinton would do 3 of these, and that phrase, the National Conversation on Race, would become ubiquitous, not just this specific initiative, but this kind of larger idea that the country needed to come together and talk about race. Like lots of conversations, this National Conversation on Race maybe didn't really go anywhere and people didn't really get on the same page. But let's look back at this initiative, what it was hoping to do, what it did accomplish, and where the idea of this conversation about race has gone almost 30 years later. So here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley for a local conversation about the national conversation, or a remote Zoom conversation about the national conversation about race, about podcasts, about history. Hello.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Yeah, talking about talking. What more?
I know, right? Very meta.
Do people want to listen to? So I think the thing that we're all fascinated about by this is this sort of basic idea that we can convene this conversation and it will accomplish what exactly? But
nothing.
Let's spoiler.
Nothing.
But before we get to that answer that we now know, what do they call it? Yeah,
No, sorry.
They call it signposting in the business.
My
right?
frustration jumped the gun.
But what is the background on what is formerly known as the One America Initiative, and why is Clinton the one to kind of convene this as best we can determine?
So this was an initiative that basically Clinton is putting together to try to have these conversations about race, to talk about affirmative action, which is very much in the public discussion, to still sort of talk about what wasn't really talked about, which was the Rodney King riots that took place several years earlier. I mean, the country exploded with racial violence. And it feels almost like a Groundhog Day, right? Every year or so, we come back to this national conversation on race, especially when there's a new, sort of president in office who has a mandate to sort of discuss these things and act like he's tackling these things. Clinton also sort of has, deep relationships with the Black community. And so this, I think, was his way of trying to show his effort toward driving some of these initiatives.
I think it's worth taking just a moment to talk through everything that was happening in the build up to this, because it is kind of odd timing. It's the start of his second term. So he doesn't have any more elections to win. Now he seems to be using his political capital to convene this conversation. So 1991 is when Rodney King is beaten and the film starts to circulate. 1992 is when the officers are acquitted and the LA uprisings happen. Then immediately after that, you have O.J. Simpson and the O.J. Simpson trial.
Oh, yes.
And then in 1996 in California, you have a proposition against affirmative action. And so it's as if all of these issues just have become dominant storylines every single year. And we can talk about how effective this response is, but Clinton's response was, wow, it seems like there's a lot going on in America, in California especially, around racism. So let's hold a national conversation.
And we also have to, guys, put into the pot, too, this what's known as the sister soldier moment, where, Clinton, I think, has his own history with kind of trying to reckon with tricky conversations around race and racial issues. And another element here is Clinton loves the town hall. The guy loves the town hall. He's good at a town hall.
He's good at
right?
a town hall.
And so I think it's an understanding that this is the way that this is going to sort of manifest itself, right? It's not a bunch of blue ribbon panels. And no, it's me heading out into the world and talking to, quote unquote, real people about the sort of issues that matter to them.
Which also totally speaks to Clinton's self-conception.
Sure.
That he has the charm and the
Yes.
empathy and the connections
Charisma.
that he alone can kind of convene this conversation and move it forward when it comes to talking about race and racism in the United States. Maybe not he alone, but he definitely believes that his political talents can be deployed
Yes.
to this end and that there's a real chance of success.
I think a more generous interpretation of that is that he's actually sort of devoting a limited amount of his second term political and sort of just like actual time capital to these things. I mean, it is remarkable that he's sort of committed to these when there's lots of other things on a president's plate, I suppose, at that time.
I don't know. I still feel like I mean, this is the thing about second terms. You're not going to be in office again after that. So I feel like, I mean, in my sinister side, it's like you're trying to shape a legacy that this is something that you did. But if you were really committed, you would have done it in the first term. Not that it would have worked then, but like it would have at least shown that you were not tethered to like polls and all kinds of things, you know?
And I think with Clinton, it always is. It's a both and.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. So before we get to kind of how these actually came together, what kind of conversations took place, and what the sort of mix of policy and rhetoric was, I think we should introduce this person by the name of John Hope Franklin, who is a academic, civil rights leader, and he is the one who's tapped as the kind of head of this initiative. So I don't know if we've mentioned his name
I love
before.
John Hope Franklin.
Yeah, so
he's one of my favorite historians.
Oh yeah. Well,
Benjamin
it's just
Quarles
nice that a
and John Hope
historian gets a shout out here, right? First of
I know.
all.
I'm like one of the few people that care about these things. But as a historian, he was always GOAT for me. He wrote the first African American history textbook, From Slavery to Freedom. That was just an instant classic.
That was in like the 40s, right? That he wrote that?
Yeah, it really was. I mean, this takes place decades ago, where when you sort of wouldn't, before there were even Black Studies departments, before there's even African American Studies, he's creating this textbook, and he's well respected within the field of history. He was your traditional historian, but he was writing about Black history in a way that nobody else really was, or few others really were. And so, because he has a deep amount of respect, he gets tapped by Clinton to lead this conversation. And I think in that sense, it's appropriate, I think, that we call on historians to sort of make sense of things, talk us through the past, let us know how we can understand, this particular moment. But I don't think it was fair in the sense that John Hope Franklin is not a policy creator. He's a historian. He's a scholar. He's an academic. He's like, I can write a book, but creating policy, creating national conversations, I think that's a different sort of wheelhouse. And in that sense, I don't think he's sort of given a fair shake at an opportunity to accomplish something effective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that puts exactly kind of the position he was in sharp relief. I mean, he was active in the civil rights movement. He was an advisor to a lot of civil rights leaders. He worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, but it was always sort of from a historical perspective. And I think the criticism of him was that he was a little divorced from the sort of grassroots movement and policy change needed. And he was sort of a true believer in kind of history, context, dialogue as being the thing that will lead to incremental change. And so, he's either the perfect person for the job or the perfectly wrong person for the job. Yeah.
I mean, he's a perfect person for the job in the sense of what the job was, right? The idea of having these national conversations on race was really built on two pillars. And one of them was perfect for Franklin. It was this idea that you were going to explore the history of racism in the United States, that you are going to talk about like how the U.S. ended up where it was, and you wanted to understand how the country got where it was. And then there was going to be a kind of policy focus that looked at the way that history of racism had shaped policy outcomes. And this is something that will be super familiar to listeners because we've been talking about this in the forefront of politics, I would say, for like the last decade, right? Ever since Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations came out, there was this kind of foregrounding of the structural and historical forces that shaped disparate outcomes in the United States. And so, this idea that you were going to look at gaps in employment, in education, in healthcare, in home ownership, in the criminal punishment system. That all of these things had racist outcomes, and the goal of the conversation was to explore some of those.
Yeah. But again, the Groundhog Day aspect is that, like, we have also done this before. Like, there was the Kerner Commission that comes out. There are all of these commissions that are put in place to sort of figure out, how did this happen? How did we get here? And they all pretty much say the same thing, like housing inequity, job inequity, either unemployment or underemployment, high policing. Like, they talk about all of these structural inequities, but there's never an attempt to actually solve those inequities. We can just name them, and that's kind of like where it stops.
But actually, I thought of the Kerner Commission actually while thinking about this initiative too, because the Kerner Commission was in the late '60s in the wake of the long hot summer, and it was more of a like blue ribbon panel commission that did a bunch of interviews and did a bunch of research and then issued a report with like tangible recommendations. And, at least to me, we've done an episode on the Kerner Commission and talked about it a number of times on the show. But to me, its legacy is more like it was actually really kind of concrete and salient and it was ignored.
Yes.
But it was actually like pretty brass tacks of saying like, hey, you want to solve these things, and to me, whether the desired outcome of this initiative, this national conversation on race, may have been the same thing, which is let's look at the history and let's think about some of the structural things that led us to this moment and what we can solve. But the format is very different. Is that best accomplished by gathering a bunch of regular people together to kind of be in dialogue with each other, led by a historian and a white president? How brass tacks can you get at the end of a conversation like that? And so, that I think is the larger context here, the thing I'm really fascinated by. I think there's value. We can talk about it. There's value in talking about these things. I think it's very important. But I think there's a disconnect between the kind of like policy outcomes and the sort of rhetorical work of an initiative like this.
I think that there are two things that stick out for me when I think about this national conversation. And one is the kind of theory of racism behind it. This idea that the reason that there's racism in the United States is people don't understand the history of racism and the disparate outcomes. And so if we can just explain that, then we will get that much closer to getting political buy-in for policies that will reverse some of this, which I am skeptical of that as a theory, but nonetheless. And the other thing that sticks out to me is the Clinton administration is not signing into law policies that are consistent with this idea that there are structural inequities and racism. If you think about the drug policy, crime policy, mass incarceration under Clinton, it doesn't quite jibe with this national conversation on race.
Yeah. There are three initiatives or imperatives for this initiative that Clinton puts together. One, he says we want to expand opportunity, we want to demand responsibility, and we want to create one American community based on respect and shared values. That sounds fantastic. However, there's no infrastructure, money, policy put in place to expand any opportunity. Demand responsibility from who? Who is taking responsibility? Is your administration going to take responsibility? Like there's
You've heard Clinton's speeches. He's going to demand responsibility from.
And then how do you sort of and the idea of like creating community and sort of respect and shared values, that feels so abstract, I think, when you're trying to implement something like that on the ground. Like what?
But I actually think that third one, Niki, you talked about the sort of theory of race relations that is undergirding a lot of this. I think another big part of that theory is, I think, something Clinton believes to his core, which is just if we just get to know each other as individuals, the racism will melt away, and that a big part of this is we just need to talk to each other and spend time with each other. And he talks about sort of growing up in the South, and he's like, I didn't know anyone whose heart was racist if they had spent time with people of another race. And so that is a huge part of this initiative. Part of me believes in that too, but it's just about, does that match or does that get you to the sort of policy goals that you're going towards?
Well, Clinton is from Little Rock. Clinton grew up poor. Clinton grew up in proximity with a lot of Black people, and because of that proximity and poverty, he shared a lot of connections. He's very comfortable being around Black people. That's not most Americans' experiences when you think about how deep segregation works. If you are, in a particular state, if you're outside of the South, if you're in the suburbs, you don't have close proximity to Black people, and you certainly don't have close proximity to Black poor people. And so, there are experiences that he is having that I don't think are sort of par for the course in terms of how Americans are experiencing solidarity.
But he's trying to kind of manufacture those experiences through this initiative, right?
Well, that's what I was just thinking, and this will be my one Clinton defense, is that, first of all, that was his experience, that living side by side and sharing struggles together had been something that, for him, had made it very natural to work with Black people and to sort of develop a kind of anti-racism. The other thing that I will say to his credit is that there's this book called A Fabulous Failure, which is about the progressive vision at the heart of the Clinton administration, that they try to get off the ground and they just run into barrier after barrier after barrier. And so there is also a way of looking at this as saying Clinton tried a lot of stuff in his first term. He could not get it off the ground. And so he's taking a step back to try to say, okay, well, if I couldn't get buy-in my first term, how can I get buy-in for some of these ideas my second term? Maybe this will work. And so it's a kind of throw everything at the wall attempt to create some openings for more progressive policies. I'm not going to say that I'm 100% sold on that, but I think that's a legitimate argument and way of thinking about it.
Hey, it's Jody. First off, I want to say thank you to everyone who has already donated to Radiotopia's fall fundraiser. And if you are listening and you haven't donated to the network before, you might wonder where exactly your dollars go. Well, the short answer is that it goes into making 3 episodes of this show every week. You hear the names of the folks who help make the program. Our researcher, Jacob, our producer, Brittany, Kaula, who does the transcripts, and of course, Niki and Kellie and me. And I'm a big believer that people should be paid for doing that kind of work. Look, I want to be clear about something. No one is getting rich off of this show. But I've been proud of the fact that over the years, even as the media landscape has gotten rockier and rockier, and we have ridden that roller coaster of ad dollars going up and down, we have still found a way to do it. And I'll be honest, there are months where it's really, really tight. There are some months where I don't come out in the black, but I still value making this show and supporting the people who help make this show. And I think it is important to keep plugging away, paying people for their fair share and their hard work. And I can't say this enough. Listener support is a huge part of the puzzle that I just described of how we make it work. We literally, figuratively, metaphorically, pick your Ali, we could not do it without you, really. So, if you can, take a moment and become a member of Radiotopia. You can do it right now at radiotopia.fm/donate. It's tax deductible, and yes, there is a sweetener. When you do, you'll receive a special curated playlist from Radiotopia that we put together just for you. It's very cool. Go check it out. Again, radiotopia.fm/donate. And thank you. All right, let's get on with the show. As you start to think about the gifts you'll get people this holiday season, keep in mind that it is really wonderful when you can get someone a gift that they wouldn't necessarily get for themselves. Maybe a little bit of luxury that they don't know that they're missing. For quality gifts at an affordable price, my go-to is Quince. Quince lets you treat your loved ones or yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price. Honestly, I think of Quince as that secret hack that your most stylish friend has. You're always wondering, how do they know the angles to step up their style game? Well, this is the angle. You can get a cashmere sweater for $50. I, not the most stylish person in the world, but someone who likes to step it up from time to time, I have a pair of linen pants from Quince, $49. I got a linen shirt to pair with it, $29. That's right, I'm going head to toe linen. I do that from time to time. Quince has got jewelry, Italian leather handbags, European sheet sets, whatever you're looking for. All Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. And they're able to do that because they partner directly with top factories, cutting out the cost of the middleman, passing the savings right on to you. So it's time to gift luxury this holiday season without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/thisday for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. All right, now you know the secret hack. Quince.com/thisday. I also think it really is important to remember that kind of late 90s is very different kind of media and landscape. The idea that we could have a national conversation wasn't sort of immediately met with eye rolls, I think, in the late 90s in the way that it would now, for better and for worse reasons. But Kellie, I have a question for you because as I was looking at this, I want to talk a little bit about some of the policy elements, especially affirmative action, which is the sort of most salient policy that gets discussed here. But in terms of this question of like convening and talking to each other in sort of small groups with a charming moderator, there's someone else who's doing that same sort of thing in this era. And I'm curious, as I was thinking about Clinton going around and gathering people and being like, well, all we need to do is look at each other and talk to each other. And all we need is a very charismatic person holding a microphone, stepping out into the audience.
Enter Oprah.
There you go. So I don't know. Is this Bill Clinton just trying to be Oprah for a bit?
That's actually a valid point. I mean, she has sort of set this template. I would say not just her talk shows in general, but especially in the 90s at this moment are Phil Donahue's doing a lot of this stuff too. Jerry Springer's doing it very poorly. But there are a lot of people that are trying to have these conversations on their talk shows. Ricky Lake, people do this later as well too. But I think there is something to that, to the fact that maybe if you're not even gathering in your home with other people like a book club, but you're all sitting down in front of the TV at 4 p.m. watching a particular show, and then you're going to the water cooler, you're going to work the next day, and you're saying, did you watch the show? Did you see or hear what this person said? There is a lot of that, and I do give credit to that. Some of those shows that Oprah Winfrey did are imprinted on my mind in terms of how I think about pivotal key moments, like the Rodney King riots, where she has this town hall and some of the comments and some of the feedback she got from the audience is it still stayed with me. So, but I can't sort of say oh, well, this shifted and changed and created yada, yada, yada after that. But it definitely, there was a mood or a vibe or a feeling or sentiment, if you will.
And I guess the question is, are these kinds of conversations appropriate and best left to the Oprahs of the world? And then actual politicians of the world need to kind of pick up the baton from that conversation and actually implement policy change, And so I think there's a little bit, just a little bit of disconnect between who's trying to play what role in this.
What? Well, and it's better than the later iteration of this, which was Starbucks.
Yeah. Oh, God.
Oh, God, we should do an episode on that.
Oh, my God. Absolutely. We have to do an episode on that. I can't.
Yeah. And, I will say, and I'll say this when we do that episode too, there is that part of me that still believes yes, this stuff is important. Yes, we need to talk to each other, but of course it needs to connect. And so I guess that's part of the question of, let's wrap up a little with some of the policy skim that's on top of this. I mentioned that a lot of these conversations ended up sort of floating into affirmative action, which was the sort of, I think, big sort of racial justice policy of the time. And if there's one moment, Kellie, you want to watch some of these town halls, but if there's one moment from these town halls that kind of jumps out, it is this moment where in one of the conversations, this is at the one in Akron, they start talking about affirmative action, and Bill Clinton mentions Colin Powell. And he says, look, I am in favor of a policy and a system that allows someone like Colin Powell to rise through the ranks and become what he has become. And that's his defense of affirmative action. And a conservative member of the audience responds and says, look, I think Colin Powell got to where he is because he's incredible. And I believe in a country in which exceptional people like Colin Powell should be able to just make it to the top on their own merits. And Colin Powell didn't need your help. And that is sort of everything in a nutshell. And I think that's largely seen as the conservative person who clapped back sort of won that exchange. But I don't know.
I think Colin Powell would beg to differ.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Colin Powell would say, I'm a proud beneficiary of affirmative action.
Yeah. But it just is illustrative of how tricky these conversations are when you've set them up to be had in this format. I guess.
Yeah. And it boggles my mind that we never consider the classroom as the prime space to have these conversations because K through 12, certainly at the collegiate level, like these conversations are taking place. And why aren't we sort of having these conversations with educators about how to do this work? Because they're in the trenches. They're the ones that are teaching the American history and civics and everything that you're supposed to get when you go out to become an adult in the real world. And like, if these conversations were had much earlier, and they are to some extent, I think we would have a different outcome.
But when they are, it's so politically fraught.
Yeah.
Right? The arguments over standards and curriculum and now over DEI and
CRT.
not allowing the teaching of Black studies and other things. Like, I agree with you that that's one of the most important places for those conversations to happen. And it is also one of the most policed spaces where those conversations happen.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we could ask a little bit about legacy. And, I don't mean like legacy, like how are we doing with when we talk about race in this country? But, specifically with this initiative, it happened a few times. And then, Al Gore starts to run in 2000. He kind of says, maybe I'll consider doing something similar, but maybe not. He loses. And then, the September 11th attacks happen, and the baton was never really picked back up. You name-checked Ta-Nehisi Coates, starting in the 2010s and then certainly obviously into 2016 and into 2020, we have had these moments where often not kind of like convened, but they sort of bubble up because of news events. Does it feel like the sort of more cynical, jaundiced view that Americans have towards this idea is actually effective? Does it push us towards actually kind of thinking about outcomes, or do we still need a little bit of this spirit of like, let's get together and talk with each other?
I kind of want something more substantive than a conversation, but I think it can be yes and. I mean, I really think you kind of need both. You can't just plunge in with here's the new law, and at the same time you can't not have a conversation, but tethering those things together, tethering like legislation with conversations, I think is something that would feel much more effective than just a talk show host or a politician doing a town hall for 90 minutes. You need something that's more sustaining than just, I don't know, the ratings that you might get for that particular night.
I also don't think that we have at the moment a national institution or politician or even personality who has the credibility to convene such a conversation across political divisions and a variety of outlooks, which is why I actually value the moments when it comes from the bottom up. I mean, the conversations that people are having, as complicated and as sometimes off the rails as they were in 2020, were actually really valuable because people had this hunger to have these conversations, and particularly white people had this desire to try to like make sense of things that they hadn't really grappled with before. And again, like, it wasn't perfect, but it came from a real desire to understand. And I think absent that, I don't think that you can do a top-down convening that is going to be worthwhile.
Yeah.
I mean, something you said, Kellie, about kind of needing to pair the conversation with action and legislation makes so much sense. I mean, I think so much about, on this show, like, we talk so much about backlash politics being one of the most powerful forces in America, if not the most powerful force in American history. And the backlash is going to be there from the moment the conversation starts. And so if your initiative is just conversation, then you're going to just be hit with the backlash. And so you need to pair it knowing that the backlash is going to be there. So, you know, you have the conversation, and then it needs to be followed up with actual legislation, because you're going to get the backlash no matter what. So you might as well just sort of see it all the way through. All right. Well, I'm glad we had this conversation. And I don't know what we accomplished other than, taking a little trip back to the late 90s. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
I think that the point I wanted to make is, to whatever extent you can have an economic approach that embraces people of all races, if it elevates disproportionately racial groups that have been disproportionately depressed, you'll help to deal with the race problem. But no one could look around the world. If you forget about America, just look at the rest of the world. No one could doubt the absence of a deep, inbred predisposition of people to fear, look down on, separate themselves from, and when possible discriminate against people who are of different racial and ethnic groups than themselves. I mean, this is the primary factor in the world's politics today at the end of the Cold War.
Radiotopia.